Good Monday, everybody. How the hell are you? I'm Jeremy Birmingham. That's Bill Landis. We are unfortunately going to have to talk about what happened on Saturday as Ohio State fell to Michigan 45-23 in a game that simultaneously, to me, Bill, felt like it could have been 65-23, but also felt like it could have been 31-23. I don't know that I really felt any major difference in that fourth quarter from what the final score was to how it could have turned out, because it seemed like the game was over for all intents and purposes as soon as CJ Stroud threw the first interception on an effort play to try to keep something going when he probably shouldn't have thrown a ball, which happens under pressure and in that situation. But after that, nothing really mattered as far as what happened on the scoreboard.
Yeah, it wasn't quite garbage time, but it certainly felt that way. I don't know, but I think there were those long runs too were I think born out of some things that Michigan had gotten going earlier in that second half as well. So I think there's stuff you can learn from them, but certainly ends up being a more lopsided loss than probably how things played out on the field. I think the score's a little misleading, but it was 28-3 in the second half, and Ohio State did not play particularly well on either side of the ball too. So
No, I said that in a column I wrote for OhioState.Rivals.com on Sunday. It was the worst second half of football I've personally ever witnessed from Ohio State, as far as top to bottom, offense, defense. Everything was just bad. Coaching was bad. Decision making was bad. Playing execution was bad. It was just bad all around. And I said it on Snap Judgments on Saturday, but to me, the real underlying theme was just missed opportunities. Ohio State should have been up 3 scores or so heading into half, and the vibe is completely different. And you just knew with a team like Michigan, it's a good football team. They're extremely well coached, very well disciplined. Like, you're not going to choke them out in that game unless you take them out in that first half. They were not going to give up. They weren't going to go into halftime thinking, oh no, we're down 3 points to Ohio State. They probably went into halftime thinking, hey, we're only down 3 points and we only had 2 plays that mattered in this entire half. So it was just one of those afternoons where I've never seen anything like it in my time covering Ohio State.
yeah, I have a few kind of overwhelming thoughts coming out of the game, and certainly after rewatching it. But really high up on the list is what you said: missed opportunities. Like in the first half, I think they got a little maybe too cute with some of the stuff they were trying to do with Xavier Johnson, throwing him the ball, and some of those package plays. Just Michigan, had down. They weren't surprised by them. I really do think like Jesse Minter, sort of when he had to be Michigan's defensive coordinator, was a step ahead of Ryan Day. So I want to give a tip of the cap to him. He called a really good game. I don't think an overly complex game, but had his guys ready for what Ohio State was going to try to do to them. And anytime Ohio State tried to throw a wrinkle out there, it didn't really work. Penalties bogged them down and kind of stalled momentum on a drive. CJ Stroud, I thought, missed that throw to Cade Stover on the fourth down. That stalled a drive. So they had to settle for a field goal once. They had to punt a couple times, and it just really felt like the way they were moving the ball at points, especially in the first quarter and most of the second quarter, that they should have probably had 2 or 3 more touchdowns on the board. And if it goes into halftime with Ohio State leading 28-10, even if that big play does happen for Michigan and they still end up with 10 points to tie the game at 10-10, but Ohio State can get it to 28-10 or 24-10 or something like that. I think it's a totally different feeling for both teams coming out in the second half. But I think the fact that Ohio State really couldn't land that punch gave Michigan a lot of confidence, and also I think probably shook Ohio State a little bit that they couldn't pull away from them so early.
I guess to me, one of the more frustrating elements of this entire thing, I'm going to be honest, I didn't rewatch the game. I don't think I can't bring myself to watch it yet because it's so frustrating for the fan in me, which I know I'm not supposed to, acknowledge, but he exists. Is that all year long we've talked about Ohio State and the play calling as being unimaginative and predictable and, un-Ryan Day-like, as we've discussed it all season, with the mindset that they're doing that to set up Michigan, and yet they just did all of the same stuff they've done all year long. And no one was surprised, and except for seemingly the Ohio State coaching staff when those things didn't work. There was not anything that they did that surprised Michigan or caught them off guard. The throwbacks to Stover, the tight end screen, the times they used Xavier Johnson to just telegraph it the way that they were. The best play for Ohio State continues to be the most simple one, which is run the ball up the middle and throw the ball to Marvin Harrison and Emeka Ibuka. That's what wins the games for Ohio State. And they just all year long have tried to do so many things cute and trying to just, I don't know. I don't even know what it is, but to me, sometimes it feels like there's too much of an attempt to be a professional style offense rather than taking advantage of your playmakers and letting them do the things that they do. I mean, you could, you may have a different thought on that, but to me, it seemed like Jim Knowles in the defense was attempting to be uber aggressive because Ryan Day and the offense were being uber conservative. And I just don't think that there was any synergy between the two sides of the ball at all. And every time Ohio State on offense came out and got more and more conservative, Knowles sent the defense back out there and got more and more aggressive. And Michigan took advantage of that by just doing the little things we've talked about again all year: misdirection, quarterback run, simple stuff that is not really hard to see coming. And yet Ohio State seemed like they were not prepared for it at all.
Yeah, I'm not enough of an expert in Michigan to know, or on Michigan to know how much they deviated from what they do. But from watching them a lot in the week leading up to it, it looked, by and large, like their offense, with the exception of the one fullback pass play on 3rd and 1, which was an excellent call and kind of a trick play. I think Michigan sort of stuck to who it was, and Ohio State, I think, got caught in this weird place between wanting to hold stuff back and save it for this game, wanting to, on some level, kind of do what got them to that point, and the result was they couldn't quite figure out how to operate in that game. Throwing the ball at times, to me, I think my view on the offense might be a little different than some other people's, because I saw a lot of Ryan Day's got to throw the ball. I actually thought that he again abandoned the run too early. With the way that Michigan was defending them, they were dropping guys quite a bit and sort of just daring them to try to throw the ball down the field, which is really difficult. Meanwhile, they ran the ball really well in the first half, and actually did some different stuff. They ran a lot of gap schemes, or more gap schemes than they normally do, and they were pretty effective. They ran, this is getting way in the weeds, but they ran a variation of an outside zone play that was to the same side as the running back out of shotgun, which they have never done this year. And they got 24 yards on it, and then they never ran it again. And I thought there was some good stuff there from Chip Trainum. And then he hardly touched the ball at all in the second half. And I don't know why that happened. I think, we've been critical of Ryan Day in the past of being aggressive, I think, to the point where he wants to throw the ball a little too much and not take what's coming to him. I thought they were way too keyed in on trying to throw the ball down the field when Michigan was clearly selling out to not let them do that. And because of that, they got themselves bogged down yet again in a big game. But I don't know. Before the game, one of my keys was don't show up and try to out physical Michigan. But then the way the game transpired in the first half, they were owning both lines of scrimmage. And then for some reason that changed in the second half.
Yeah, I don't know why it changed. And I think ultimately that's the question that everyone's trying to answer. But for me, I didn't, as I said, I didn't rewatch this, but I did watch a lot of football on Saturday night when I got home. And I'm taken by the fact that right now, all over college football, there are play callers and offenses that are doing everything they can to utilize the weapons in their offense and to do it quickly and to do it in space where people are being forced to make plays. We've talked, I hate to keep saying all year long, but ad nauseum, we've talked about the fact that the Ohio State offense seems predicated on CJ Stroud throwing the ball into the most difficult windows he could possibly throw it into. And on Saturday, there was just more of that. I'm watching, Washington State and Washington on Saturday night. And Washington State has a transfer from Incarnate Word in San Antonio, who is just dynamic, a dynamic quarterback who's just making plays, running all over the field. I know you don't want a quarterback who plays with their hair on fire all the time, but I can't help but wonder how much different Ryan Day's offense is forced to be when there's a quarterback who isn't able to make things happen on his own. And that, to me, continues to be, it's an issue, not because it's a knock on CJ Stroud. He is who he is, and he's a great quarterback. And I'm super impressed by the way CJ handled himself Saturday during the game and after the game. And I think he's been an incredible ambassador for Ohio State. And I hate that people sort of view him or treat him the way that he's been treated. But it does make you wonder as you look at the rest of the quarterback room, like Devin Brown perhaps being a touch more athletic than Kyle McCord. Does that give him an opportunity to do some things differently? Will Ohio State go in that direction? Dylan Raiola obviously is the number one player in the country. He can move around quite a bit, but he's not designed that way. I'm looking at Michael Penix at Washington. I'm saying, just watching that game, it was a revelation to see play calls and an offensive mindset and mentality that was attack, 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 where Ohio State, for some reason on Saturday and most of the year, has been content with just dink and dunk. And I don't really get it.
Yeah, it's funny. Like, if you think about some of the things that have given Ohio State's defense problems this year, it's been like get guys in space and dare Ohio State to make a tackle. And like it's college football, players make mistakes. I think more often than not, when you put defensive players in those positions, the offense is probably going to win. But Ohio State doesn't do a ton of that. A lot of it's down the field. A lot of it's vertical. A lot of it is, like you said, CJ Stroud having to fit the ball into like NFL windows, which is why he's very good. Most of the throws that CJ Stroud makes in this offense are not throws that the common quarterback can make. I want to make sure that I express that clearly, because he's awesome at some of that stuff. But it does at times feel like they make life a little too difficult on themselves, and that certainly felt the case against Michigan. And to see it kind of juxtaposed to Michigan's offense, which was like not terribly efficient, like really not efficient at all, but hit a bunch of big plays and sort of like let JJ McCarthy be a playmaker and kind of figure stuff out, and did get guys in space until it started like wearing Ohio State down with the run game at the end. It just made Ohio State's offense look all the more I don't know if stagnant's not the right word, but just sort of kind of stuck in gear and not able to find any kind of flow. And I made like another thing that I kind of came out of the game thinking was that there's a playmaking ability at the quarterback position for Ohio State that does appear to be holding them back a little bit. Like, and even saying it that way kind of feels harsh, because I don't want it to come off as hypercritical of CJ Stroud. It's just not his strength. But when that's not your quarterback's strength, I think the margin for error decreases quite considerably. And Michigan, meanwhile, had a kid in JJ McCarthy who was a little bit fearless in making plays, and ultimately that was a major difference in the game.
Yeah, and Ohio State knew going into this game that they wanted to challenge Michigan up front and make JJ McCarthy beat them. And he did that by just throwing the ball to wide open receivers. So to me, like, we go back to something else we've talked about all year long. Like, the Ohio State cornerbacks have been very average, except Cam Brown when he's been on the field. Unfortunately, in this game, he does not play the second half. And, I'm not sure it made a huge difference at that point. As I said on Saturday night, Michigan only threw the ball 5 times in the second half. But Jordan Hancock's healthy enough to play. Why is he not out there? If he's physical and able to get out there, he couldn't have done worse. I mean, I just think that there's a situation where there's just too many guys in that Ohio State locker room being concerned about feelings and not results. That is hard to swallow for people. And I get it in some degree. I know people, it's important that these coaches are not just yanking kids every time they don't make a play, but we've seen so many times where they just don't seem like they are physical enough in what they're doing. And if you knew Blake Corum was not going to play after the first drive, first run of the game, first run of the second half, Michigan, those were honorary carries. It wasn't even really, they weren't trying to play him. They knew that. If at that point you're Ohio State, why are you still putting 8-9 guys in the box every time and leaving your corners, who have been your weak spot all year long, in a position where they have to make a play or give up a touchdown? It's that, to me, is where I have some problems with the way Jim Knowles called this game. I understand being aggressive, but you can't just keep putting those guys out there by themselves and not switch up into a zone or do something else. It just didn't make any sense. And then to continually over and over and over again evacuate your safeties from the middle of the field by having Ronnie Hickman and Lathan Ransom crashing all the time. I just don't know what I was watching.
It was weird. It was simultaneously, I think, like the worst game the secondary collectively has played and the worst game that Jim Knowles has called. And that is obviously an issue when those two things get combined on the same afternoon. I think it leaves Ryan Day and Jim Knowles in a pretty interesting spot, because when Ryan Day brought in Jim Knowles, that like signaled a pretty significant philosophical shift in what Ohio State wants to do defensively. When Ryan Day first got here, it was all about keep everything in front of you, play it pretty straight up, and don't allow big plays. Jim Knowles' defense is more willing to allow big plays with the trade-off that it's going to make more than on their end than you do on offense. And for a lot of the season, that's what happened. But then that aggression came back to bite them in a major way against Michigan. That was where the yardage on the touchdown, 69, 75, 75, 85, and
45.
65 or 45.
No,
Yeah, 45. Yeah. So like that is like I put that on Jim Knowles' play calling. 2 of those plays are like a direct result of him blitzing against the pass with nobody in the middle of the field. Like, yes, Cameron Brown should have made that tackle. Yes, Lathan Ransom shouldn't have had his eyes in the backfield on the quarterback when he let Colston Loveland run right by him for a 45-yard touchdown. I'm not like exonerating those guys, but they weren't put in positions to succeed, in my opinion, either by a defensive coordinator who somewhat understandably was very keyed in on stopping the run, because that's the thing that did in this defense last year. And I'm sure it was like the thing that he and Ryan Day talked the most about when Jim Knowles got hired. But the dynamic of that game changed when Blake Corum wasn't available, and Ohio State didn't really seem to adapt to that. They challenged Michigan to throw the ball, and Michigan threw the ball. And it was like, if they made any adjustments to that, it was far too late by the time they did.
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot to love about the Jim Knowles defense, and I think it's been a great fit for Ohio State. I think it will continue to be a great fit. But when you're playing a defense that is prone to giving up big plays, you have to play complementary football on offense and take shots and speed up the game, because that you can't allow yourself in that position where you're willing to give up 4 or 5 chunk plays. And as I said, again, all year long, when you play against teams that have athletes that can take it to the house against you, as opposed to just picking up 40 yards and getting caught, it's very different. And for Ryan Day then to not come out and be extremely aggressive with the offense when that's going on, I just didn't understand. You have to understand in this Jim Knowles defense that you're going to give up big plays. But this is why he was such a great fit in the Big 12. Everyone was scoring 48 points a game. It didn't matter if you gave up a couple big plays. You had to get a couple turnovers, and you had to get 1 or 2 stops to win the game. And obviously people don't want that. I understand that. But in this game specifically, when you're letting your corners be out there and just get toasted, when you're playing your safeties up at the line of scrimmage the entire game, when you're a safety driven defense and you're not letting the safeties actually control the defense, because Michigan knew what Ohio State was going to do with its safeties. And I mean, the first touchdown of the game for Michigan, obviously Cam Brown, as you said, has to make that tackle. If you make that tackle, it's 4th down and 2, they're punting, and none of this happens. But when you send 6 guys and Michigan blocks them all, how are you supposed, if you know that you're willing to give up a 70-yard touchdown in that moment? That, to me, I don't ever understand the philosophy of I'm willing to give up a 70-yard touchdown here.
Yeah, I don't either. And like on that play in particular, he sent 2 safeties, he sent 2 linebackers. He totally vacated the middle of the field. And to that point in the game, I wanted to like chart this out because I was just curious. That was on the 4th possession of the game, I believe. To that point in the game, Michigan had been averaging less than 4 yards per play. It was 3.8 yards per play. JJ had made like 1 or 2 plays maybe where he got outside the pocket and completed a pass, but like he wasn't running crazy on Ohio State's defense. He looked totally uncomfortable in the pocket. And I guess on one level understand, like, if we can knock this kid who looks a little off right now on his heels, maybe actually get to him, knock the ball out, get a big stop, TFL, whatever, that's a pretty big momentum shifting play. But I just thought the state of the game at that time really should have been telling Jim Knowles to kind of just play it straight up and see if JJ McCarthy can kind of beat you just playing straight up defense. And after he called that blitz and JJ made a good throw off his back foot to a guy that was open, that kind of opened the floodgates and I think changed the tenor of the game a little bit. There were 2 things. I think that blitz that led to the big play kind of opened things up, and I think let Michigan know that they could attack Ohio State secondary a little bit, and that Jim Knowles is going to play it hyper aggressively. And then 2, when they started running JJ in the second quarter, that opened up stuff for their run game, because Ohio State through 12 games still has not figured out how to defend a quarterback run.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things that are maddening about how that second half went that it's hard to even look back at the first half and try to nitpick some of the things that actually changed the direction and flow of the game. I think clearly Emeka Egbuka dropping the screen pass that was perfectly set up, that was one of those moments where you're like, wow, that's pretty crazy. Marvin
Mm-hmm.
Harrison dropping his first ball of the season on a perfectly thrown pass from CJ Stroud. Cade Stover dropping a touchdown pass on a third down play where Stroud had to do something with his feet and threw the throwback. I mean, it was covered well, but the ball was right where it had to be. It hit Stover in both hands, and that's just one of those things where all year long you think this guy's caught, he's going to catch that ball, and I think it's oftentimes underappreciated just how different this game is for people, especially the people who lost it the year before. There's so much pressure. There's so much of an onus on you to figure it out ASAP and to try to play mistake-free football. And generally speaking, in sports, when you're worried about making mistakes, that's when you make them. You could just tell in the entire second half that Michigan was playing like without a single weight on their shoulder, and Ohio State went out in the second half thinking we can't F this up. And all they did was F it up.
Yeah, I just think they were shocked that it wasn't a bigger margin for them at halftime. I think they felt like it should have been. They felt like they left something on the table. And Michigan, on the flip side of that, felt pretty emboldened by the fact that it wasn't a larger margin. They got the ball to start the second half, went down and scored on 7 plays, I think it was. 2 drives after that was when Ohio State punted on 4th and 5 and plus territory. And frankly, like, I think it was kind of over from there. I know some more stuff transpired from that point, but that to me was the ultimate signal of, like, Michigan is playing pretty loose and Ohio State is playing very tight. And I don't know if I felt that so much in the first half. I felt like Ohio State, man, they had them in a really good spot in the first half. They just couldn't capitalize. But once it got to halftime and the game was only a 3-point game when it should have been more, those two teams came out of the locker room in like very different states of mind, and it was very apparent on the field.
I know that 4th and 5 play is something that, you know, you've talked about, and I've seen it a few other places online. I actually think it was the 4th and 2, the previous series
Before
for
that.
Ohio State.
Yep.
That was when things really changed, because it's 4th and 2 at the Michigan 48-yard line, and you punt it, which is fine and good. You then get the ball back at midfield because your defense does its job and forces a 3-and-out. You get it back at midfield, and then you have a 24-yard pass play where, again, CJ Stroud makes a play with his feet, scrambles, finds Chip Trainum on a little, safety valve, 24-yard. That ends up being, with the hold on Donovan Jackson and the absolutely moronic decision by G. Scott to hit a guy who is out of bounds for about 7 seconds. You take away that 24-yard gain and add 30. It's only a 60-yard difference. Not a big deal. You just gave up 60 yards on one play. And this, maybe I'm getting into the weeds here when it comes to my concern with Ryan Day as a play caller. And it's not necessarily that I think he's been unoriginal or whatever this season. I think it's that it has precluded him from doing his job running the program on game day because he's so worried about calling plays. You have that moment right there where G. Scott, again, makes an absolutely inexcusable penalty in the only game that matters, and a penalty that changed the entire. You had 1st and goal, or first and 10 from the 49-yard line on that drive, down 4 points. G. Scott, and this is, again, I'm not a head coach of the Ohio State University. I'm not being paid almost $10 million a year to do it. I can't imagine how G. Scott didn't have his helmet ripped off by the head coach on the sideline after that play. And I think because Day probably was so flustered and annoyed by that, he sort of wastes a play on 1st and 35.
Yep.
And like, if you have somebody else calling plays there that's maybe able to separate the moment or compartmentalize the moment, that you get a better play on 1st and 35. You're not in the situation where you end up needing 17 yards on, 3rd and 22 to be where you are. Ryan Day talked a lot last offseason about how he wanted to be a touch more hands-off on game day this year, and that he needed to trust his coaches so he could run the program in general and be more of the CEO type of coach that Urban Meyer was. And that's probably a good idea. You can't be all things to all people every day when you're a head coach at a place like that. I just think that there's something. I don't know if it's Kevin Wilson. I don't know if it's Brian Hartline. I don't know if it's somebody on the outside of the program as it currently is constructed. But if you go back to, Urban Meyer in 2012, his offense had been stagnant around college football for a few years. People sort of figured it out. And he brought in a guy from Iowa State who nobody really ever heard of, and he changed the entire direction of the Ohio State offense. When that offense stagnated in 2016, Urban Meyer went out and got this guy named Ryan Day and said, hey, you're going to renovate what we do. There's a reason that most coaches don't call plays, and that's it. Unless you're Lincoln Riley and you don't worry about defense at all, then you don't care what happens, because you're going to, you have the ability to I don't know what they do. It's pretty crazy, but I don't want to be too critical of it, and I want to be very clear about something, Bill, and I'm sorry for rambling.
Sorry.
The amount of stuff that I've read in the last 2 days from people on the internet, from Ohio State fans especially, and I don't like to be soapboxy, but come on, people. Like, this is me speaking to you directly as a guy who grew up in Ohio, loving Ohio State and loving them as a fan, who now is fortunate enough to be on the other side of this and get to know these people as people, while occasionally trying to wear both hats. There's not a person in the country who I think is a better fit for the Ohio State program than Ryan Day, and I think people should be thrilled that he's the Ohio State head coach. But that doesn't mean he's infallible, doesn't mean he's perfect. Certainly, he's going to be harder on himself over these last 48 hours than anyone else, but the types of things that people say and suggest are just, it's ludicrous on its face. Mm-hmm. And I think it really hurts the program a lot more than people think when you see just a deluge of stuff on Twitter, where recruits and families and stuff are seeing this stuff or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, there's that side of it, but I mean, and I would agree with you with some of the things are just like outlandish, I guess, but there are reasonable criticisms, I think, too. Yeah. I think you touched on one there with the play calling. It's actually interesting when in 2018, when we were at the Rose Bowl, we knew Ryan was going to take over. I wrote a story at the time about Ryan wanting to call plays, and his desire to do that, and I talked with Urban Meyer about it. And Urban said, like, I think it's really difficult. I know a lot of coaches try to do it, and I think there comes an inflection point where you have to decide what's like best for the program and like what you think is fun. And that's me paraphrasing. I don't think he didn't say that exactly, but that was sort of the gist of it. Calling plays is really fun. I get the desire to want to do that, especially when you have an offensive mind like Ryan Day has. But I think it's high time now to he needs to ask himself what is best for the program moving forward. I think there's a ton more on a head coach's plate than there was when he took over in 2019. That takes a lot of his time and focus away from designing the offense and calling the plays. There's stuff to handle on the sidelines, as you said. I think when you're so keyed in on calling the plays as a head coach, you kind of lose the feel for what's happening with your team on the sidelines sometimes, and I think he's been caught up in that too. And I'm of the mind that there needs to probably be a change there. In terms of the overall structure with the offensive play calling. And again, like if that's Kevin Wilson or somebody in from the outside who has a different perspective and maybe some new ideas, I can see it both ways. I see the value in both, but it just doesn't feel like it's working right now. Ryan Day like designed some really cool stuff. Like, I don't want to say like suddenly the guy's forgotten like everything there is to know about offensive football. He's clearly got a very sharp mind, but the feel for the down-to-down play calling, especially in these big games, seems to be lacking quite a bit. And to me, there's an easy fix for that. It's to give it up. Yeah. But I know that's not an easy decision or easy thing for Ryan Day to do. But we've had a few games of evidence now that maybe he has to. So I'm kind of wondering how high up that is on the list of things that he's giving a hard look at this offseason. And it's funny too, because like we're talking about like the season's over. The season's over. They might make the playoff if TCU or USC loses. So like I'm trying not to get totally in the offseason mode just yet, but it's hard not to after they lose to Michigan.
Yeah, and that's the challenge. I think that there is a risk sometimes that anything that you say that is positive after a loss comes out as you're being a homer. Anything that you say it's negative is spot on. Like it's not that black and white. Urban Meyer should know better than anyone how difficult play calling is for a head coach, because if you look at his tenure at Ohio State, he had his best seasons with the offense when he wasn't calling plays because he had offense coordinators that he trusted. That was 2013 and 2014. He didn't really trust Tom Herman yet in 2012. Really kind of gave the reins to him in 2013 and 2014, and the offense took off. 2015, when Ed Warner and Tim Beck in 2015 and 2016 were at the helm, Urban Meyer called the plays. I don't care what anyone says. Urban Meyer is the guy that made the decisions, and the offense stunk those 2 seasons when you had 2 of the best teams in program history, talent-wise. 2017, he brings in Ryan Day and realizes, I trust this guy. I like his vision. I'm going to let him do it. It wasn't the same thing. He wasn't handcuffing Ryan Day the way he did Warner and Beck. And then now here we are 5 years later, and you have to ask yourself, if you're Ryan Day, what do you need to do? Last year was clearly a line in the sand with the defense. What has to change? I don't think that the offense is in such a way that you have to have wholesale changes. I think clearly, they still had 500 yards of offense in this game, but it's clunky 500 yards as opposed to being what we've expected out of him in previous years. And I just think that, as you said, the mechanics of how this happens on game day has to change. Whether it's Kevin Wilson or someone else, the mechanics of how they do it has to change.
Yeah, I mean, they're number 2 in scoring offense and they're number 6 in total offense. Like it's not fundamentally broken whatsoever. But yeah, it's more of a procedural thing than anything else. It just feels like they can help themselves a lot more by simplifying things, taking it off of Ryan Day's plate. And listen, that's a hit to a guy's pride too. Like I don't want to undersell what that would signify if Ryan Day does that. I always figured there would be a point where he'd have to give up the play calling as a head coach, because I think most successful head coaches arrive at that point throughout their tenure if they're any good. Maybe I didn't think it would happen this quickly for Ryan Day after 4 years, but it just feels like a necessary step after what we've seen. But it doesn't mean like the offense needs to be totally revamped. Like I still think Ryan Day has a good vision for what the offense should be. I just, the game day procedure of it, I think, could be better than it is right now.
Yeah, I think that it's faster than we thought, but everything in college football has changed so much in the last 5 years that the ability, as you said earlier, to like zone in on calling plays. There are so many other things going on around college football right now than ever before. We're 1 week away from college rosters all over the country essentially being dismantled because of the transfer portal will reopen on December 5th. We have no idea what's going to happen. I mean, we're talking, as you said, like the Ohio State's still not out of the playoff race. By next Monday, when the transfer portal opens, we'll know who's in the playoff, and pretty much 127 teams around the country are going to have their roster picked apart. This is not the same college football that it was when Ryan Day took over at Ohio State at the start of the 2019 season. So there has to be an adjustment that he has to make. And again, I just think people need to take a step back and understand that they're 45-5 in his tenure. It's obviously not 100%. And he knew when he took over the job at Ohio State. What did he say on December 4th, 2018? Beat Michigan and win every other game. Like he knows. It's not like the guy's naive to the fact or expecting people to gloss over the losses because they're beating everyone else that they're supposed to beat, as you wrote on Sunday. Like those games are the only ones that matter. And they have to get better. And the moment that he was at a year ago with the defense is where he's at now, not with the offense, but with himself. And that's going to make it, that's the hardest part, because it's not a situation where you have coaches who are not performing. Kevin Wilson does a great job. Tony Alford does a great job. Justin Fry, the offensive line, was leaps and bounds better this year than they were a year ago, even with some struggles at the midpoint. Brian Hartline is obviously, perhaps the most talented and most productive assistant coach in the entire country. This falls on Ryan Day to make decisions that are going to require him to swallow a bit of pride and say,
yep,
what can I do to make the program better? And that is a hard thing for a man to do when, like, it is your program and you realize the thing I have to do to make it better is to take a step back and let other people do stuff. That's a challenge. That is a real challenge. That's what ultimately, I think there has to be a balance here, because Ryan Day was also on the coaching staff in 2018 and 2017 when he saw Urban Meyer, the guy that brought him to Ohio State, having a number of coaches on that staff that shouldn't have been on the staff. He had Urban Meyer took himself so far out of it that he let coaches who shouldn't have been there be there and take some of the golden years of Ohio State football and turn them into 55 to 24 losses to Iowa. So
Mm-hmm.
like there is a balance, and I don't think it's as easy as people want to make it out to be, or to say, fire Ryan Day, bring in Luke Fickell. Like it's not how it works. You're not going to bring back Urban Meyer, folks. I'm sorry. Like that's not realistic. It's not real life.
No, that's certainly not realistic. Nor do I think in the end that would be a terribly good thing for Ohio State. Yeah, it's like it would be different, I think, if Ryan Day had any previous head coaching experience to this, but like he's kind of learning on the fly while driving a Ferrari. and
Yeah.
and I think that brings a unique set of challenges. Not to say that he is not cut out to handle them. Like, losing to Michigan for the second time in the second year in a row, I think is a little bit of a referendum on his coaching tenure. I think that's okay. It's allowed to be. It probably should be. That's the most important game at Ohio State. He also probably deserves, or maybe deserves isn't right the word, but maybe should get a chance to kind of write that and figure out a way to get it done. I mean, I'm not saying he gets to do it forever.
He's not going to get 6 years like Harbaugh.
Yeah, like John Cooper got too long to get it, and Jim Harbaugh at the time felt like he got way too long to figure it out. But then guess what? He figured it out. So I don't know. I think there's a balance there if you're someone like Gene Smith trying to figure out where this goes from here. Like Ryan Day's seat, I don't think is particularly hot. I don't know if it should be or not. But he's going to get a chance to get it right. But if you're a person who's like, I don't think he can get it right, then I don't know. We'll see. You'll probably be proven right on that in a year or so if that's the case. But he's done some really good things too. It's just that the thing he's supposed to do more than anything is beat Michigan, and he's not doing it right now.
Yeah, I mean, he's 1-2 against the Wolverines, and that is not good enough at Ohio State. And as you mentioned, I mean, he's got 364 days now, 363 days, sorry, to get it right in Ann Arbor against a veteran Michigan team at that time with a brand new quarterback and a lot of other things that Ohio State doesn't have in its favor heading into next season. And so that's going to put the onus on Ryan Day even more to fix it and get it right. Because as much as people are now sort of scheming on his downfall or expecting it to happen, he already knows that. And that doesn't help him or anyone else to keep hearing it because he does know it. And he's, again, that's the best I can say it. Like the guy's not dumb. Like he understands what's on the table.
Do you think like last year's Michigan loss, like up there, I think can be like attributed to a few different things, but one of them maybe Ohio State felt like that was a fluke. And like it was a weird weather day, like guys had the flu, like that wasn't a real representation of who Ohio State was. They were going to come back this year and just put it on them. And then it turns out that like they don't have that psychological advantage anymore. And also like Michigan is pretty good now. Like this is not even like for Urban Meyer and Jim Tressel, like Michigan, and I don't know, you can correct me if I'm wrong, you've been watching Ohio State football longer than I have. Michigan is much better right now than it was at any point in Urban Meyer or Jim Tressel's tenure. And Ryan Day is dealing with a different animal. But I think
I would think that the 2016 Michigan team is leaps and bounds more talented than this current one.
Okay, and Urban Meyer needed double overtime in a favorable spot to beat that team.
This one is coached better and they're better disciplined. This one is a result of Jim Harbaugh doing what we've talked about a lot here, which is taking his hands off of things and letting other people that he trusts do the job. And I think that was the single biggest difference between Harbaugh 3 years ago and Harbaugh now. And so, but yeah, I mean, obviously Tressel played against some extremely talented Michigan teams in 2016.
2006,
was great. But it's a different era. That's a different era. And Michigan wasn't sure what they were going to be. They know what they are now. And Ohio State, I think, is the one in the position of trying to figure out what identity is going to be their identity moving forward. And, I'm not trying to make excuses again, because whenever you give explanations or rationales in moments like this, it's going to come off as an excuse or, sugarcoating things. But I would love to see these two teams play again, where you have Blake Corum playing, and you have Jackson Smith and Jigba playing, and you have Travion Henderson and Mayan Williams playing, and you have a healthy Matthew Jones. Austin mentioned it on Saturday on Snap Judgments, and I think it's probably been under talked about all year, is how much different Ohio State had to be without Jackson Smith and Jigba. It's kind of weird that it hasn't really been talked about, because he is the player that everyone thought was going to win the Blitnikoff coming into this year, and many people thought he's the best receiver in the country, period. And because Marvin Harrison's done so well, and because Emeka Ibuka's had big games, people sort of think, oh, well, Buckeyes have just picked up and moved on. It changed the structure of everything they do offensively. And then when you eliminate Mayan Williams and Travion Henderson from half the games, like, things are different. It's not excuses. Ohio State has to be better. Some of this is on the recruiting in the last couple of years, where you have players not panning out. But when you have a running back who was a linebacker 6 weeks ago, and a guy who was a walk-on getting as many targets or more targets than Marvin Harrison in the game against Michigan, that's weird. Like, it's you can't count on that 6 weeks ago.
Yeah, I do respect that on some level, but then the other side is, like, Michigan didn't have its best player, and it didn't seem to matter all that much. So,
that's the thing. I mean, Corum is a great player. Donovan Edwards is a 5-star running back. Like, you replace studs with studs. That's the way it works. But I'm talking from a structural standpoint of what Ohio State does. Michigan's offense doesn't change what they do without Blake Corum. They just change who's doing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fair.
Without Jackson Smith and Jigba, the entire structure of the offense changed. And I don't think that Ohio State was ever able to recover from it as much as they tried, and as much as they were able to sort of gloss that over because the rest of the schedule was so bad.
I think I can agree with that. It did never seem like they quite figured it out. And I don't know too, probably the idea that they sort of treaded water without him, thought they were going to get him back, and then lost him again immediately, probably made that all the more difficult to deal with as they kind of went through the second half of the season too. So I think it's obviously a monumental loss for that offense, but I think there were also ways around it that Ohio State didn't quite embrace, especially in this game. Which are also emblematic, I think, of some larger issues with Ryan Day in general, which is an aversion to running the ball when that makes the most sense to do, and just, like, having a feel for how games are going and calling the right plays and sequencing plays together and stuff like that.
Well, that's pretty much the storyline of the 45-23 loss. I mean, to Michigan, it is a game that will haunt a lot of people around Columbus for a while, or at least until Ohio State gets a chance to avenge it, which will happen 363 days from now in Ann Arbor. And we're probably going to talk about this game every day until then. So there's no point in talking about it too much more on this Monday edition of the Podcast Daily. But we will talk about it at Roosters on the live show, which will be at 1:30 at the Roosters on Olentangy River Road in Columbus, if you want to swing by and join us there. Otherwise, Bill Landis, myself, Jeremy Birmingham, and of course, Austin Ward will continue to talk about this all week and all of our lives, because it's what we do. Folks, I got a quick note out there. We're entering potentially the off season here. So if you have other stuff or content ideas, or, things that you think would be interesting for us to talk about or to dive into as storytellers, we would love some feedback from you on YouTube or over at ohiostate.rivals.com, where you can currently sign up using promo code RIVALS22 for a full year for $22, which is pretty good. I think that sale ends on Monday, so you might want to hurry up into that. Other than that, we're going to keep going. So we would love to hear some feedback, because this is going to be the first off season we've had as we dive into the podcast on a daily basis without having football to sort of buoy us the whole way. So give us your thoughts. Okay. That's Bill. I'm Berm. This has been the Podcast Daily for Monday, November 28th. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. We will see you later.